their defensive positions on these steep ridges overlooking the town of Nancy, the French had unparalleled fields of fire into the open valleys below. This time, as the Germans came on, it was the French turn to cut them down in huge numbers. No one knows exactly how many men died on this spot. The Germans never admitted their casualties, but best estimates put it at 1/3 of 1,000,000. With the German army on the frontiers halted, Joffre turned his attention to the north. He now had to improvise a new plan to stop the German advance on Paris.
It permitted Joffre to leave a weaker defensive force there while he transferred troops westwards towards Paris to take part in what was going to be the critical battle of the whole campaign, the Battle of the Marne.
The French railway system now gave Joffre a critical advantage. Unlike the Germans, who had to march hundreds of miles to the south to reach the critical battlefields, Joffre could redeploy his troops to the north in just a few days by using the trains. Von Schlieffen had always warned that the German army would need to have won the decisive battle against the French within 40 days of the beginning of the plan. In the north, his schedule was still working perfectly. And on day 35 of the plan, the first encounter of that battle took place along the River Marne, east of Paris. It was the Battle of the Marne that finally halted the German juggernaut that had steamrolled its way through Belgium and France in the previous 5 weeks. The troops that Joffre had rushed so hastily to Paris became the new French Sixth Army. This was the force that finally counterattacked out of Paris and drove the Germans back. The French dubbed this the Miracle of the Marne. It saved France, and it marked the collapse of von Schlieffen's great plan. But it also doomed anyone's hopes of a short war. In the immediate aftermath of the Marne, von Moltke made his final, fateful misjudgment. He decided to retreat north and ordered his troops to take up a defensive position on the River Aisne, where they began to dig hasty defenses. The horrors of trench warfare had begun. But what if von Moltke had not made his fatal errors? What if Ruprecht and Kraft had been forced to stick to the principles of the Schlieffen Plan? With the French army trapped on the German frontier, the Sixth Army, the one that turned the Battle of the Marne, could never have been formed. And the most decisive battle of 1914 would have been transformed from a French miracle into a German triumph. To discover how the Schlieffen Plan could have worked, you need to look at the area where it fell apart, the frontiers. If von Moltke hadn't crumbled under the pressure from Kraft and Ruprecht and ordered the counterattack, the French army would have penetrated much deeper into German territory. And when the inevitable counterattack was ordered, the results would have been just as devastating. But with the French army now much deeper inside Germany, they could never have retreated back to their defended frontier.
If we assume that the French forces on the eastern frontier have been tied in by the German left, then there is no fresh French army, the Sixth Army, forming around Paris. And it's on that basis that you can begin to argue that the Marne could have gone the other way and that the Germans could have won the campaign in the West in 1914.
The French survivors of the Marne would have fled the battlefield and tried to carry on the war from forts like Verdun. The armies closest to Paris would have rushed back to defend their capital. By September 1914, Paris was nothing more or less than a huge fortified city. Nearly 3,000 guns protected this area. Of course, the plans for the siege had been made even before the Battle of the Marne, the city being placed under martial law, and plans had been made to demolish every single one of these bridges across the Seine. Every road, even the sewers leading into the heart of the city, had been barricaded and blocked off. They were even going to demolish the Eiffel Tower. If a victorious German army reached the outskirts of Paris after victory on the Marne, the siege that would have inevitably followed would seem like déjà vu to the city's older residents, because Paris had been besieged by the German army only 44 years before, in 1870. That siege had pushed France to the brink of a second revolution. It had resulted in starvation and had ended in surrender and humiliation. The war in France would probably have dragged on for the rest of 1914. But with the bulk of France's army destroyed or captured at the Marne and the frontiers, Germany's eventual victory was guaranteed.
In such a scenario, with the French completely surrounded, I think it is likely that the war would have come to an early end on the Western Front against France, that France would have had to sue for peace, the kind of peace that Germany would have wanted, and that would have really reduced France from the position of a great power to a second-rate power, really, in Europe.
With a French surrender, the victors would have sought a location for the signing of a peace treaty, somewhere in eastern France, near the Marne, on the route to Paris. Where better than a medieval city that lay at the heart of a nation's pride? If the Kaiser and Germany had really wanted to humiliate France, they could have found no more potent symbol than here, the ancient cathedral city of Reims. Reims is sacred to French culture. Every French king was crowned here. The idea of being forced to sign a peace treaty with the Germans here would have been a particularly bitter pill for the French to swallow.
France would have been subordinated to Germany, particularly in economic terms. It was decided that trade with Britain would no longer really be possible, and that France, although not annexed, would certainly be subordinated.
With the threat from France now gone, von Moltke would have quickly put the second half of the Schlieffen Plan into operation. He could now start moving the huge German army east to face the threat of the Russians.
It's more difficult to see what the outcome in the east would have been. I think they probably would have settled in exchange for territory, and they'd have wanted more of Russian Poland, but probably not much more. I think they'd got the best of Poland. They probably wouldn't have wanted very much more. They might have wanted the Baltic states, which the Russians would probably have handed over, and Finland.
With France and Russia now defeated, von Schlieffen's great dream would have become a reality. Germany would be Europe's preeminent power. But the continent's other dominant power, Great Britain, would have found it very difficult indeed to accept this new status quo.
One shouldn't underestimate the kind of belligerent foreign policy that I think a victorious Germany would have implemented, particularly against Britain, which for many was the arch enemy, the rival on the colonial front. But it's difficult to know what Britain could have done vis-à-vis such a powerful, victorious Germany, certainly in the short term.
Britain in 1914 was the world's greatest sea power, but with her army evacuated back to Britain, she would have been unable to cause a victorious Germany much harm. But Germany would likewise have been unable to use her vast army to undermine British power. The two countries would have probably remained at war for years, shadowboxing in a series of indecisive battles across the globe. A German victory in 1914 would have transformed almost everything about the 20th century. The great family dynasties of Europe would have survived, and the revolutions that toppled them may never have happened. Even the Romanov Tsars of Russia would have ruled on past 1917, as Lenin's Bolshevik revolution would not have come about.
In 1914, Russia, although not a well-governed country, was already becoming remarkably prosperous. It was developing its industry at a higher rate than any other country in the world. And in any case, what hope would those exiles like Lenin and Trotsky, what hope would they have had of entering a country which was still firmly under the military and police grip of the Tsarist government and starting a revolution? I mean, they would have been locked up. They wouldn't have got off the starting blocks.
When the Germans were defeated in 1918, they suffered the draconian terms of the Versailles Agreement. They lost territories, industry, and most of all, their national pride. The resentment of this humiliation was the very thing that an Austrian corporal exploited to further his own political ambition 15 years later. A successful Schlieffen Plan would ensure that Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich would have remained in obscurity.
I think it would have been much more difficult for Hitler to find an audience for his agitation, because Germany after 1919 is an incredibly divided nation, and it seems to me the only thing that unites Germans across the political spectrum, perhaps with the exception of communists, is that they all resent Versailles. And it is a propaganda vehicle that Hitler really needs and that he knows to use well, to provoke popular discontent, to rally popular discontent, and to rally the masses around his anti-Versailles message. So I think without Versailles, Hitler wouldn't have come to power. Yes, so that's obviously an important what if.
But not only did the Versailles Agreement happen, the Schlieffen Plan failed to bring about a short, decisive German victory.
The purpose of the Schlieffen Plan is to avoid a long war. That is what Germany cannot stomach and doesn't want. It's what Schlieffen fears. If the Schlieffen Plan had delivered that, had delivered a short war, then one of the most immediate consequences, not only for Germany, but for other powers in Europe, is that war would actually have remained a more viable policy option. So from that point of view, it creates a frightening world.
If the Schlieffen Plan had worked, it would undoubtedly have created new and dangerous tensions between the great powers of Europe and their ruling houses. But those tensions could hardly have had any more disastrous consequences than those that followed in the wake of the 4 terrible years of the First World War. Von Schlieffen's dream would have seen France defeated, Belgium occupied, and Britain humiliated. But Europe would have been spared the horrors of the greatest calamity the world had ever seen. 10 million lives wouldn't have been lost, and millions of others would have been spared the physical and the mental mutilations that would blight them for the rest of their lives. But whatever future might have awaited the world following a German victory in 1914, it could have been hardly worse than the violent and terrible 20th century as we came to know it.
Coming up on UK TV History, Richard Holmes tells the stories behind some of the secret